Greetings to all. In this video, we'll be discussing what are the ECG changes and basics of how those manifestations were seen theoretically in case of right and left ventricular hypertrophy, and in subsequent videos, we'll be talking about right bundle branch block and left bundle branch block. So let's go into the topic. So first of all, let me draw a diagram. Okay, uh, so this is our heart. Okay, and here I am drawing a cross section of our heart. So this is the cross section showing uh, right ventricle and left ventricle. So let me label it. So this is your right ventricle, and here it is your right ventricle, and the next one being the left ventricle. So this is your left ventricle and this is your left ventricle. I think it would be better if I draw this diagram a bit bigger. So this is our okay. So now let me use another color here. Okay, so actually what it happens is that okay, let us place the chestlets first of all. So somewhere here it will be your V1, V2, V3, V4, V5 and V6 in case of chestlets. And when we see uh, after septal depolarization, gradually the ventricles get depolarized. So the polarity of left ventricle will be facing this way, so the vector will be like this. So the resultant vector of right ventricle will be like this. In the same way, the depolarization also propagates in the left ventricle, and gradually the direction becomes like this and the resultant goes like this. Similarly, if we draw that representation in the chest lead from here, uh, so the left ventricle mostly will have uh, depolarization vector like this, and left ventricle will have mainly depolarization vector like this. So you might be getting idea already, as like what we discussed in uh, case of atrial enlargement, that you see the depolarization vector here is directly facing towards V1. So the right ventricular ECG morphology can be nicely picked up by V1, whereas left ventricular ECG morphology can be very nicely picked up by V6, and the direction is towards the V1. So positive vector moving towards the positive exploring electrode. So the V1 will be picking up most of the resultant vector will be positive in case of V1. Okay, so till now it's clear, I hope. uh, for better understanding also, we can draw another example or another schematic diagram. Suppose this is the cross section of your chest, and here are your leads V1, V2, V3, V4, V5 and V6, and when you draw a heart inside it, so there lies your heart like this. And when you see most of the right ventricle, this is the right ventricle, so the depolarization of right ventricle is facing towards the V1, and the depolarization of left ventricle will be facing towards the V6. So it's reasonable to say that for for right ventricle you need to look at V1, and for left ventricle you need to look at V6, because we have already talked about now the direction of the vector falls directly upon them, so the best image will be picked up by them. Okay, I hope till now it is clear. Now in next diagram I would like to explain uh, what will be the changes in case of normal and abnormal uh, B1 and B5. So let us look at this diagram and compare it now. So I will keep here normal, NOR MAL normal, and we will keep B1 lead and B6 lead. So what actually happens? So let me draw a small heart here, or okay. So when the impulses travel from bundle of his and Purkinje fibers, initially there will be septal depolarization. So this will be the vector of your septal depolarization. So here you see there will be slight septal sorry there will be slight septal depolarization towards the right side, isn't it? And since the direction is towards the V1, so there will be slight positive deflection. So there will be slight positive deflection. Okay, after that, after this septum it becomes depolarized. So now this septum has become depolarized, and now the ventricles start to get depolarized. So the right ventricular vector will be in this direction and left ventricle direction will be here. So by that, but the thing you need to keep in mind is that, so you see here the length of the vector I draw from the right ventricle is smaller than the length of the vector I drew from the left ventricle, because the left ventricle it has greater muscle mass, so the vector magnitude will be greater. So the resultant vector will be shifted towards the left side. So in this diagram, if we draw the resultant vector, so the resultant vector would be somehow like this. So this vector is facing towards V6, not towards V1. So V1 will be finding negative deflection. If the vector would have been gone towards the V1, same as the septal depolarization, it would be positive. But you see now the resultant vector depolarization is going towards the left, because the muscle mass of the left is more, so the resultant vector will be shifting away from V1. So you will be having negative deflection. So in case of V1 you will be having QRS complex like this. Similarly, in case of V6, if you look at the normal heart, first initially there will be septal depolarization, and in this figure you see the vector of septal depolarization is facing against V6. So there will be initial slight negative deflection, and then you see the resultant vector depolarization is facing towards V6. So there will be positive deflection, and you will see QRS complex like this. So I hope this is clear to you. Now in case of right ventricular hypertrophy, so we'll be drawing we'll be taking now right ventricular hypertrophy, RVH. So what happens in case of RVH? In case of RVH, you see the right ventricle will be hypertrophied, isn't it? So the magnitude of right ventricular depolarization will be greater. So the thing you need to keep in mind is that when there is hypertrophy, there will be more muscle mass. So the resultant vector will be now inclined to this direction. So the resultant vector would be more towards this direction. Initially, in normal case, the resultant vector was facing towards the left direction, but in case of right ventricular hypertrophy, it will be facing towards the right side, that is towards the V1 lead. So in this diagram, when we draw the resultant vector of ventricular depolarization, most of the vector will be facing towards V1 direction. So in this case, you will be having positive deflection in case of V1. So there will be positive deflection in V1 because the resultant vector now has shifted towards the right side. So you see here, so this is your right ventricle. When it gets hypertrophied, so the resultant vector will be somehow like this, shifting towards the V1 side. So V1 will be picking up greater magnitude of positive deflection rather than in case of V6. Now you see the resultant vector of right ventricle is facing towards the V1, so the deflection V6 will be negative. So you will be finding here negative deflection QRS complex. So this is the example which you see in right ventricular hypertrophy. So you see it will be positive in magnitude, positive deflection in V1 in case of RBH and negative in V6. So am I clear? Again let me explain. This is your heart, isn't it? And here we have our V1, and somewhere here it may be lying V6. So in right ventricular hypertrophy, so this is hypertrophied, so the resultant vector will be facing towards V1. So V1 will have positive deflection. You can see here positive deflection, maximum magnitude will be positive. However, in case of V6, the vector is opposite the direction of V6, so the deflection will be negative. So you see here it is negative deflection in case of V6 in right ventricular hypertrophy. Now we will be discussing about left ventricular hypertrophy. What happens in left ventricular hypertrophy? So again let me draw the heart here. So somewhere here there will be V1 and somewhere here it will be V6. Normally the vector was like this normally, but in case of left ventricular hypertrophy, now the resultant vector would be facing this way. So it will be facing towards the V6. So positive vector going towards the positive electrode. So V6 will have positive deflection, and V1, so it is going against V1, so V1 will have negative deflection. So this is the basic ideology that you need to keep in mind is, in normal case the V1 will have maximum magnitude of negative deflection, whereas V6 will have positive deflection, and the similar features will be seen in LVH. So you see here there is negative deflection in LVH, also there is negative deflection in V1, whereas in case of V6 there is positive deflection, and in case of left ventricular hypertrophy in V6 also there is positive deflection. Actually there are certain criterias like the magnitude of R peak. So this R must be greater or equal to 30 mm. Similarly there may be features of like what to say, if there is right ventricular, if there is, suppose this is left ventricular case, so in left ventricular hypertrophy you will be having left ventricular left atrial enlargement also, because eventually there will be fluid overloading, so eventually there will be left atrial enlargement features also you can get. And there are different criteria, and another thing is that this is called discoid interval, that is also increased. So you need to learn those criteria theoretically for them to call left ventricular hypertrophy, but here I am only explaining the basic understanding of why the deflection is positive and why the deflection is negative. So you need to read the guideline for left ventricular hypertrophy and right ventricular hypertrophy and left ventricular hypertrophy. However, this is the basic electrophysiological concept.